Hello, my name is Padraig McKeon. I'm coming to you today from Dublin in Ireland. I'm a career communications advisor. I also lecture in public relations and communications at Dublin City University. I want to talk to you for about the next 15 minutes or so on a topic that's evolved, if you like, from both my life experience and my academic and consulting experience. And it's just to maybe give some points of reference or to discuss and extrapolate some thinking on the whole area of planning for public relations activity in new territories. Now, this isn't a 1 to 10 points to do. It's not a rigid plan. It's not a specific method for approaching new territories. Instead of that, what I'm doing is I'm going to extrapolate from some of the academic theories around bringing communications from one country into another and the academic frames of reference, and try and give ourselves a couple of pointers, and also to point in one direction in particular that I think is a good and positive development in how one might approach that kind of planning work. I'm going to share some slides with you just to assist us through this brief little session. So basically, where we start in terms of any communications activity in any marketplace is with the plan. We will all have a plan. We will all want to have a plan. And I guess the question I'm asking here is, when you have a plan and you're used to working in a particular way with a particular client or in a particular situation, is that applicable in a different environment or a different situation? Now, typically your plan will have 8, 9, 10 headings. It will do everything from analyzing the situation at the beginning, to figuring out what resources and what means of assessing success or failure you have at the end. And your plan typically will probably include these headings or headings like this. But I guess the question I'm asking today is, what happens when you head for the sun? What happens when you need to go to a different country, a different environment? You're flying away from the presumptions and the knowledge and the experience and the perspectives that you have in your home marketplace. Will that plan still work? Will it still be able to achieve the objective that you have to communicate a message, to communicate and deliver an intent into to other audiences in other places? And what I found from personal experience is that when you first go into a new environment, things are spinning. There's a lot of new things to absorb, learn, and know, and not everything is different. And that's the assumed starting point here. The world you're going into, the environment you're going to work in, is going to be very different to the one that you've come from. And many of the presumptions, assumptions, and baseline of knowledge that you would have in your home and prime marketplace may not exist, or certainly you cannot, I would argue, assume they exist. So what are the frames that we use? How do we go about deciding what we would do? Well, there is a global theory. Now, the global theory is derived in an academic context as part of the Excellence Project back in the 1980s and early 90s. But ultimately, what it did was it looked at how one could apply appropriately a frame of reference to the work that one might try and do in a communication situation. It's to find some sort of a starting point by which to assess or guide. And I'm, as I say, not suggesting that this is a rigid framework, but it is a means of understanding the world. And it certainly is a mindset that I would suggest and direct people towards. Because what it does is it allows you to recognize the variations, and to understand the actual frames that are going on behind the scenes. It's not so much focusing on the detail, it's looking at the broad sweep of things, the general environmental factors that are influencing the market or the territory that you're moving into. Now, in its original formulation, there were 5 headings around that study brought forward as being the ones through which one should look at a communications project not in the local marketplace. Political ideology of the country, the economic system of the country, the degree or otherwise of activism of the country, the culture of the country, and the media system in the country. And those 5 were further refined into 3 headings, and that ultimately give us a little bit more substance around how we would look or assess a new environment or a new territory. The first thing would be look at the broad infrastructure for communication. So how does communication, how do messages delivered, how are they sent, how are they received, in terms of how the political system influences that, how the legal system influences that in terms of is there freedom of speech, and where is the role of the media in the particular country, and we'll come on to that a little bit more. The level of economic development, so I guess the extent to which it is a developed or developing or otherwise country. The level of social activism and the extent to which people have the opportunity to be socially active. Have they got freedom for speech? Have they got freedom of association? Have they got freedom of travel? All of those things are not to be taken for granted because every environment is different, and all of these things will impact on the way communication works. And this is what we're looking at here. How will communications work in this environment? Clearly, the media environment is a huge part of that. To what extent are the media free media? Are they controlled? Are they of different types? Are they all domestic or are they international focusing? Are they the subject? Are they invested in by international media organizations? So where does control lie in the media? And how is outreach done by the media? And what access is there for the citizen to the media? All of these are important things to consider when looking at how one would look at getting communication to work in a new environment. And then also we have to work at the societal culture and look and recognize the societal culture. And how does society do things? How do people read and think about what's going on? How do they take meaning from what is around them? And is it done on a collaborative, collective, community basis, or is it done in a different way? So these are among the questions that one has to ask. But also in the current environment, you've got to ask yourself the question, is that enough? Because our world has changed greatly. And these are frames of reference that were established in the 1980s, early 1990s. The world doesn't quite work that way, does it anymore? So we have to recognize that, communication, for example, is no longer limited by geography. I, sitting here in Dublin, are consuming US and particularly UK media all the time, originated in the UK for UK consumption, delivered in real time into my marketplace. So communication is not limited by geography, and that's just TV. Clearly, the internet has brought that to a wider range again, and communication is not now just coming from institutional sources, but it's coming from society at large through social media. So communication is no longer limited by geography. The issues of the world are the issues of the country, and again, Ireland is a particularly globally open country, so we would have we are experiencing experiencing controversy around issues here in Ireland that are issues for everybody across the globe: climate action, diversity, social inclusion, security, public health in this current environment, etc. So global issues now mean that the way people consume information and the way they work with that information is much less limited by those kind of reference points for local media that might be, if you like, the preserve or the perceived perception of those global themes. And also the reality that our publics are not fixed. They form dynamically around the conversation that we're having all the time, and they're influenced by it, and they're influencing it. And that becomes a real part of the communications planning piece. And also to, I suppose, recognize that there are power imbalances between the public and organizations. And that will have to be at some level negotiated in any sort of a communications plan going into a new world. So with that in mind, and working last year with a colleague who is doing a master's dissertation in Dublin City University, Unisa Quaid, she looked at the whole area of the circuit of culture. And I think that's an interesting area to develop and follow, because the circuit of culture does give another way of understanding an environment. And it's a broad way of thinking rather than a prescriptive approach. Way of thinking about how an environment works, and particularly how meaning is formed, because ultimately communication requires that you define meaning. You give meaning to somebody for somebody. You give them something that they can understand by virtue of that added meaning, or they can bring with them and to another place by virtue of that added meaning. So meaning is an important part of it, and the circuit of culture has a very strong role to play in understanding that. So the concept of the circuit of culture is one where there are 5 moments that describe it of articulation, which combine to form meaning. Now, this is not a linear process. These are not 5 things that happen, one followed by another, followed by another. These are 5 things that are going all the time around us, but that they give or support the giving of meaning to any particular message, any particular story, any particular event. So it's to understand their existence as a way of influencing how that might be seen or heard. That's what we're about here, is to understand how the world works from a communications point of view. So to look at those 5 headings. The first is the idea of representation, that the meaning around something, and the meaning that is shared between people, comes through dialogue and discussion. And that also recognizes differences and imbalances, but it provides an environment within which they can be discussed. So the representation of them in that discussion, in that language, helps to frame them. And that becomes an important feature of the communications planning, because that's what we're ultimately trying to achieve. There's also the concept that production gives meaning to something. So what we produce or choose to produce, are the structures that we produce them in, are the structures that we house them in, are the structures that we organize through, all of elements of production. So we produce something, we stage something, and that gives meaning. That actually gives evident meaning for others to what it is that we're trying to do. There's the concept of consumption, that ultimately meaning derives from use. So I demonstrate clearly the relevance and value of something by consuming it and making it part of what I'm doing. Identity, which is really a drawing on both reproduction and consumption, because by observing how things are produced and how they're consumed, one gets a strong sense of where the important issues lie for a particular group of people or a population or a cohort. So, the identity, the sense of identity, and recognizing that there are multiple identities is a very important part. And then there's the concept of regulation, and there's both the formal regulation, banking, telecoms, pharmaceuticals, etc. But there's also informal reference points, so that one doesn't actually miss the fact that while there are formal regulatory organizations, informally society regulates people. It regulates them through media forms, it regulates them through reporting, it regulates them through what is regarded as common norms or common ground. So looking at that, it is, I say, not so much as a specific, to borrow from Sagan here in relation to science, but it's not a specific scientific body of knowledge. It's a broader way of thinking. It's thinking around what is culture about here? How is meaning formed? So, the way it's done around here is, and these are the influences on it. And adding that in on top of the consideration of the more, if you like, explicitly the hard stuff, the infrastructure for communication, the political discourse, the legal discourse, the role of media organizations, etc. So these give us important frames of reference for how to plan in an international market. But as well as that, the other thing we have to remember, and is very important if we're going into a new market, is the whole concept of ethics, and recognizing that there's a different challenge when you go into a new territory around ethics. But also, it is important. It is a challenge that is worth winning, because the leader and the organization that leads with a sense of ethics will find it quite, there will be a sustainability, if you like, to their engagement with the society around them that won't exist if they don't have a strong ethical compass. So I guess the challenge when you move into a new territory is to determine what is the standard, and how do you find that? Where and how do you determine what standards are? And recognizing there will be some particular challenges there, because there may be a difference. There may be a sense of polar opposites, indeed, between the ethical, what is considered to be ethically normal or ethically allowable in one country versus another, or one territory versus another. Well, it could happen even between city and town within the same jurisdiction. But there is clearly a sense of polarization, and people don't want to be left with emblems, or don't want to be put in a position that they have to act in a way that they wouldn't normally do. There's power in the development of global ethics, because it allows some people to do and not to do. So we have to define that. We have to understand it. We have to understand who it matters to, and we have to look at the concept of shared risk, and also the possibility that we might have unequally shared risk, because we want to do something. Therefore, we perhaps give a little bit more leeway to another party. But ultimately, it is about building a framework that is sensitive and is sustainable for the organization. That's what it really needs to do. And that's what gives you a strong sense of, a clarity, if you like, around ethics. Now, to take that forward a little bit more, how do we actually approach it? Well, ultimately, you need to understand culture to understand ethics, and you need to take a culture-centered approach, because ultimately, ethics is about, there's ethics at the level of the individual, there's ethics at the level of the organization, there's ethics at the level of the society. And to understand how all these are formed, you need to understand, if you like, what's driving people's thinking. And the cultural piece does drive people's thinking. We should be aware of that. There is a model, and there are models. Here's just one from Testura and Valentini. It's a representation, really. It's not a very sophisticated model, but it's recognizing that on the one side you have personal factors, on the other side you have, competency factors, the professional environment, and there will be different norms and different frames of reference pushing in on the work-related one. But ultimately, it is important to get a strong sense, a very rooted sense of ethical purpose, because that has value over and above and beyond what might just be individual stories, individual transactions, etc. So one of the reasons that we ultimately want to have that that fundamental adherence to ethical principles is that the person who has an ethical approach never really has to describe what they do. They don't have to excuse themselves in any way, because they've already considered the issues as they would impact on the society around them, and they won't have the requirement to explain something that might be unexplainable in other terms. Um, how did I go about getting that when I went out into the world? Well, I found that walking around, not unlike management, walking around, knocking off ordinary citizens, watching what they do, watching how they consume, watching how they travel, then going up a layer, watching how they make decisions, either in the commercial space or in the public space. So I found that the simplest way to get a clear sense of what worked in that environment was to get out and about and experience the country in its rawest forms, both urban and rural, to determine how one might best behave and approach it, and then also what has meaning in that environment, what works for others, because there's no point in engaging activity that doesn't work. So that's a very, very important piece. And the other thing I would suggest is the idea of active listening. I mean, people in communications can't listen enough. And I think there is a very, there's still not enough celebration of the idea of listening, and in particular active listening, where an individual is, intentionally engaging with somebody to deliver an understanding of their world to somebody else, whether it's a planner to a senior executive, whether it's a brand manager to a planner, etc., whether it's a corporate communications manager. This, the idea of being always on listening and having a very strong filter for what's being said by key people is a critical part of what will make for an effective communications program. Because if you plan to what you've heard, you will invariably have an opportunity to deliver something that makes tangible difference. So that was a whistle-stop tour for just over 15 minutes, I think, of my take on moving into an international marketplace. I think it's good to discuss this. The Global Alliances Teaching and Education Month is a very good initiative. And look, this is very high level, and it's not a prescriptive how-to. But if you were to go back on it and actually say, well, have I done this, and have I done that, and have I done the other, more in terms of our own organization and how we set ourselves up for the opportunity to sell overseas or to sell into a new territory. But it is something to think about. And I say, not a prescriptive plan, it's a way of thinking. So with that, I say thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the rest of what you do in the context of this Education and Training Month. And here's hoping that we see you soon again. Thank you.